And what I wanted to do, what I had hoped to start doing last week, but the Wi-Fi was pretty bad at the hotel I was at. Thankfully, it's much better here in Manila at the hotel I'm at now. But um, what I had wanted to do was last week start on going through one more example together, just of the narrative process and how to study narrative, and do the example from the woman at the well in John 4. And then once we finish that, we can move on to poetry. Start looking into poetry and how to study and preach poetry. But I wanted to focus on just one more example. I think it's helpful. We'll take a whole story this time from John 4, a longer story. Before, we were looking at shorter stories like Genesis 22, just to learn the process. But I wanted to have us go through a longer story just to see how to use this narrative analysis approach in looking at a larger story. And I chose John because we did look at some examples from John before. It's a book we're familiar with. And so I thought it would be helpful to do one from there. So before we get to actually looking at the story itself, I wanted to just remind us of some of the key details of the background of the book of John, and then that will allow us to flow into looking at the story itself. If, of course, you remember the first three steps, if you're studying a story. So let's say we're preparing, we want to prepare a message from John chapter 4. Well, what would we do? Well, we want to understand the whole book, right? As we've discussed before. So we'd want to do these first three steps to have an understanding of what prompted the author to write the book, and what was the purpose of the book, what is contained within the book, what is its setting, its background, and then what is the flow, the author's flow of thought through the book. And that is how are each stories connected together? Is there a structure to the book? And what is the purpose of it? So we want to understand those things first before going to a particular part of the book. And this would be true for any book, any type of genre, but especially with narratives. We want to make sure we understand the book as a whole before we examine the individual stories in the book. And so that process begins, of course, with reading and observing the book, and that is getting familiar with the book as a whole. Of course, we won't do that tonight. That would take too long to read through the whole book, but we're pretty familiar with that book, I know, and we've talked about it before. But this will be the first step, is you'd want to read through the whole book and make observations in the book, identifying just things that stick out to you, specific observations. That is, can you identify the author, the audience, what people are mentioned, places are mentioned? Can you see the structure in the book? What are the themes? Those kinds of things. And then just general observations, things that stick out to you, questions you may have about particular passages within it. And once you've completed that step, the second step is in doing the background context of the book. And that's where now you dig in more specifically, more deeply into certain elements of the book that help us understand its background. Of course, that would mean the author, if you can determine him, the recipients, what is the historical context of the book? That's when was it written? So you'd want to identify details regarding that. And then also when the story in the book happened, the social context, the geographical context, those are the places mentioned. Cultural context is what is the culture, the society in which the story occurs? What do we know about that culture? What do we know about the culture of the recipients? And then finally, the occasion, that is what prompted the book to be written. All right, so those are just details that we want to uncover from looking at the background context of the book. And for John, to remember, I'll just go through this quickly because I think we should be familiar with it. And we looked at this a while back, but of course, we determined that John was the author of the book based on the internal witness of the book and external witness. The internal witness of the book just refers to the what do we find in the book that gives us clues or indicates who might have written the book. And I don't know if you remember, but it was probably several months ago, we looked at John chapter 21, and we were able to identify John as one of four possibilities, or three really, from the chapter. Chapter 7, well, you remember that chapter when they were fishing in Galilee and they couldn't catch anything, and Jesus showed up he was on the shore, and he told them to throw the net on the other side of the boat, and all these fish were in it. And then they realized this was a miracle they had seen before. They realized it was Jesus, right? Peter jumped out of the boat and swam to shore, and that story. Well, at the beginning of the story, it said 7 of the disciples, Jesus's disciples, were fishing, and it named 4 of them. John and his brother, Peter, and I think Andrew, and then or named 5 of them, and then there were 2 unnamed disciples. Anyway, if you go through the chapter, we could determine that John was one of 3 possibilities who wrote the book, just from that chapter alone, because at the end of the chapter it said the disciple whom Jesus loved was the one writing, and that he was the one there with Peter when Peter said, tend my sheep. Do you love me? Do you love me? So that chapter identified John as one of 3 possibilities of the author. And then external witness, that is the early church fathers, even as early back as Irenaeus, who was Polycarp's disciple, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. Well, Irenaeus said that John the apostle wrote this book, and so, as well as other church fathers. But so we have really, a secondhand testimony, that is the disciple of John told his disciple who wrote the book. And so based on the internal and external witness, John is is the one who authored the book. Now in epistles, the author tells us exactly who he is, but narratives, you don't typically have that. So we're fortunate in this case where I think we have very, very strong evidence as to the author of this gospel being John. Why does that matter? Well, it helps us in one sense, because we know, okay, this gospel was written by an eyewitness, by somebody who was with Jesus, someone who saw what Jesus did and heard what he said. Secondly, it affirms that this gospel is written by an apostle, so it has, the authority of an apostle is there as well. And then third, John has some great insights as one of the inner 3. Remember, Peter, James, and John were the 3 disciples that Jesus spent the most time with. They were with him on the Transfiguration. They were with him at certain times. So they were the 3 that Jesus spent particular time with. And so John wrote this likely when he was toward the end of his life, the end of the 1st century. So that, again, more details on that you can find on a previous class that we had, and I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was a few months ago. All right, so that's what we determine as the author. The recipients, actually, we can determine just from examining the book. Now, there's not a specific person mentioned, but there really, I think, are 2 general groups that we see John addressing in this book. The first, and I think primary group, is John intended this gospel to be evangelistic, right? He intended this gospel to, notice he says in John 20, these have been written, the stories about Christ have been written in this book, so that you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And believing, you may have life in his name. So John tells us exactly why he wrote the book, and indicates its primary audiences. He wanted to make sure those who were reading it would understand the person of Christ, who he is, that he is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that they would believe so that they would have eternal life. So John indicates here his hope is that unbelievers are reading this and will be encouraged to believe. And then also John recognized that his audience would include Gentiles. Several places in the book, he notes the translation for particular Aramaic words, indicating that his audience would not be primarily Jewish, but would include Gentiles. And I gave a couple examples here. There's several more in the book, but where he would say something in a story and then he'd give the translation for the Aramaic word. For example, in John 9, when he told the blind man to wash in the pool of Siloam, and then notice John says, which is translated sent. So that word Siloam has a root idea of being sent. And then John 4, which we're going to see as we go through the story together. The Samaritan woman said to Jesus, "How is it you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I'm a Samaritan woman?" And then John, the author, says he gives an insight. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. So now a Jew and a Samaritan would know this, but perhaps a Gentile reading this would not. And so those outside of Israel, he gives sort of this comment, this author's comment, just to give them some important insight into the story. So those would be two categories or types of recipients we see from the Gospel of John here. All right. And then the historical context. You want to remember something. When you're looking at narratives, there's two historical contexts to be aware of. All right. This is important to understand. The first context is the historical context of the story. That is, when do the events of the story take place? When do the events of the story that's being written about happen? And then there's a second historical context. That is a historical context of the author. That is, when was the book written? One example would be a book like the Book of Chronicles. Chronicles covers events that took place in the days of the kings of Israel, all the way up until the Babylonian exile, and then the release of the Jews from the exile by King Cyrus. So it covers events from the time of David around 1000 BC all the way up until the release of the exiles around 530 AD, 536. So that's the historical context of the events in the book. But if you read Chronicles, we see that the book was written probably 150 years later. There's a genealogy in chapter 7, which goes to the 7th generation of the last king of Israel, which you could estimate would be, maybe 150 or more years after the exile. So we know the historical context of the book was during the time of the kings of Israel until the release of the exiles, but the time of writing was around maybe 400 BC, 150 years later. Why does that matter? Well, because then we understand that there's a different audience here. For example, the Book of Kings, which also covers the period of the time of Solomon, or the end of David's days, all the way up until the Babylonian exile, but it stops there. It doesn't cover after that. So the events of the Book of Kings are a little bit shorter period than the Book of Chronicles, and we can determine the Book of Kings was likely written during the Babylonian exile. So the audience of the Book of Kings are the people in exile. The audience of the book of Chronicles is some 5 or 6 generations later. Okay, so the historical context of the stories in the book overlap. It's discussing the same time period, essentially, the time of the kings. But when each book was written is a very different time, generations apart. So it helps to know that, because then you can have insight into what the author his purpose and focus and theme of the book may be different. It's not just the history about the Jews. It's not just the history of the time of the kings. There's actually events in that history that each author puts together in order to communicate, to teach a particular theme or purpose. All right. The author of Kings, his focus was on why the people ended up in exile, both the northern tribes and the southern tribe of Judah. And that's why it ends with the southern tribe of Judah taken into exile. But the book of Chronicles, the theme there is that God has not forgotten his people. And the focus in Chronicles is on the southern kings of Judah, because that is the line that will continue. And so the author of Chronicles wants to give the people encouragement and hope that God had not forgotten them. So it helps to identify not just the historical context of the stories in the book, but also the historical context of the writing, the time of the writing of the book. And so in the Gospel of John, does that make sense so far? I'm doing all the talking here, but is there any questions at this point? I'm just trying to remind us of the importance of understanding the historical context of an epistle is the writing of the epistle, right? That's when the epistle was written. But the historical context of a narrative may be different than the actual time period of the stories in the narrative. In fact, it often is. Luke, he writes the events of the life of Christ, which occurred from 30 to actually from Jesus's birth all the way to his death. So that covers the events from, about 30 years over the life of Christ. But he wrote that book some 30 years after Jesus ascended. But John was different, right? If you remember John wrote his gospel. According to early church fathers, we have some insight. John wrote the book of Revelation while he was on Patmos, and it's likely he wrote his gospel and his letters not too far from that same time. Irenaeus, again, who was the disciple of Polycarp, who was the disciple of John, said that the Gospel of John was written later than the first 3 Gospels. And he says that he, I guess, probably was told by Polycarp, who probably knew from John himself that John wrote the Revelation while he was on Patmos, when he was in exile. And Irenaeus says that John also wrote his gospel while he was in exile. And this exile took place towards the end of Domitian, the Emperor Domitian, his reign, and he died in 96 AD. And so it's likely that John wrote his gospel around AD 90 or 95. Now, this is external evidence. This is evidence outside of the scriptures, but it's pretty reliable external evidence as to the time of writing. And it makes sense for this reason. It makes sense that it was written much later, because and this will connect to the occasion of the book. The epistles, as we look at the epistles and the issues, the doctrinal issues that they address, if you study the epistles, particularly of Paul, Peter, they wrote their epistles earlier, from, in the time period from 50 to 70 AD, something like that. And the doctrinal issues they deal with have to do with the work of Christ. you see a lot of that discussion, justification by faith alone, not by works. There's, Paul makes a strong emphasis of that in several of his letters. But when the letters of John, especially 1st and 2nd John, he mentions were attacks against the person of Christ, that there were people denying Jesus had come in the flesh. And so John addresses that a few times. We don't really see that very much in the earlier epistles, but we do see that in the epistles of John. So it appears that over the course of the early church history, there were mainly attacks on the work of Christ, and then those attacks grew to include the person of Christ later on in the early church. So it makes sense to me, at least, that John probably wrote his gospel, later than the earlier gospels and the epistles, and I think would confirm that Irenaeus's claim that it was sometime in the reign of Emperor Domitian while on Patmos makes sense to me. So 90 A.D. seems to be a very reasonable date of this book. Why does that matter? Why is that important? Well, again, remember now we're looking at a different time in the church's history than we were when the other epistles and gospels were written. Again, probably all the other gospels and epistles were likely written between 50 and 70 AD. But John is now 20 years later. So this is a new generation of church, really. And we're talking 60 years after the church was born. So a lot of time has passed since Pentecost and since the death of Christ. In fact, we probably have whole new generations of believers who weren't even alive in the days of Christ. And so John is writing this gospel to later generations, and in a time when the person of Christ was under attack by the enemies of the gospel. And so John writes this gospel to address, so that it makes sense then why he writes a gospel that focuses on telling stories about Jesus that show that he is the Messiah and that he is the Son of God, that he's both man and God. Because that was what was being attacked, that, certainly the Son of God could not become a man. So there were many teachers denying Jesus had come in the flesh. That's why John said in 1 John 4, test the spirits. If any of them say Jesus did not come in the flesh, they're not of God. And so he writes this gospel in order to prove, to give evidence of the divinity and humanity of Christ. That's why he begins his gospel, very differently than the other gospels. The other gospels begin with events. Matthew begins with the genealogy and then the birth of Christ. Mark begins with the ministry of John the Baptist and the entrance of Christ. Luke begins with the conception of John the Baptist and then the conception and birth of Christ. But John begins with a doctrinal statement on the deity and humanity of Christ. And then his first story is after Jesus's time in the wilderness in John 1. But John doesn't begin with a story. He begins with a doctrinal treatment of the person of Christ. Again, because this is the emphasis of his gospel, because again, that is what is under attack when this gospel was written. So John wanted to make sure that current generation understood the person of Christ and who he is, so that they would believe in the right Jesus and have eternal life. In fact, remember, John said in, I think, John 8, right? Unless you believe, he tells of a story when Jesus was in the temple instructing the Pharisees, and he said, unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. You remember that statement? John's gospel has several statements of Christ that directly reflect or recognize his deity. And he even says, unless you believe I am, you will die in your sins. So John wanted to make sure his readers understood exactly who Jesus was so that they would believe and have eternal life. All right. Questions on that? Okay.
So when Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John, say about 60 years after Pentecost, and yeah, I think his gospel is unique, right? It's not the synoptic gospel because his is unlike the other three gospel about a lot about the life of Christ, the birth and the work of Christ and historical account of his life. But for Apostle John, he yeah, his gospel is a spiritual gospel. It talks about his origin, his divinity, his yeah, he's the great I am. So yeah, so why did the Apostle John write this kind of gospel?
That you mean with the particular focus on his divinity, and is that what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's a good and important question because we have the first three gospels, right? And
mm,
they essentially, it's not like more information was needed about events in Jesus's life. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the synoptics, meaning they're together because there's a lot of overlap in their stories. But they present very clearly the person and work of Christ in those first three gospels. But their focus was on, Matthew's focus was on Jesus as the Messiah, and Mark, of course, wrote his gospel as sort of a quick overview of what had taken place. And then Luke wanted to give a thorough chronological examined approach for his Gentile friend Theophilus so that he would be certain about the truth. So they each had their own particular focus, and really were written within, I think, from 50 to 60 AD, probably the early to late 50s. And so yeah, that presents then the question, why does John, 30 years later decide another account of Jesus's life was necessary? And I think that's where that's why I'm talking about the historical background of the author is so important, because understanding when the book was written and understanding the theological challenges that existed in John's day in the late first century, then we see, he's writing this gospel to address a specific issue regarding Christ that was under attack. He wants to make sure, and he's gonna provide many stories which give specific evidence to proof of Jesus as the Christ, Son of Man, and as the Son of God. And so you can see, and that the intent is so that the reader would understand the right Jesus and believe in him. And you can see that theme all the way through. Who Jesus is and the need to believe, or the nature of unbelief. You can really link every story to that, connects to those ideas. Because again, John was very focused. He wanted to make clear from each of his stories that Jesus is both the Christ and the Son of God, and that the reader should believe. And then he gives examples of belief and unbelief all through the book. So I think he had a particular theological focus, which was on making clear through the life of Christ exactly who he is, so that the readers would believe in the right Jesus. So it's not that at all that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were deficient or left anything out, or that their books are inadequate, or that you couldn't be saved by reading one of those gospels. Of course you could. They're all inspired texts, but it's a good example of how, again, these are not just historical narratives, they're historical theology, they're theological narratives, in that there is a particular theological focus within each of the gospels, and John's was on the person of Christ. Is that just what you're asking, Joshua, or something another?
Yeah, yes. Yes, I was just curious, like for the readers, I mean, those who the recipients of the Gospel of John, uh, yeah, if they have read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, uh, yeah, what would the Gospel of John do to them? You know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, John seems in many cases, he's aware that those first three gospels would have been familiar to the church, because again, they've been circulating for 20 to 30 years by that point. In fact, much of the New Testament was, probably compiled or recognized by that point. Really only the books that John wrote that weren't in it yet. All the other books had been written. Probably the last one may have been Jude in the early 70s. So, what's interesting is, I think the only story that's in all four gospels is the feeding of the 5,000, right? If I remember correctly. And then John's gospel contains, I can't remember the percentage, was like 70 or 80% of what is in John you don't find in the other gospels. So it's a lot of new material. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a high number. So there's a lot of new stories or events that we don't find in the other gospels. And I think, again, John, like the woman at the well, the story of Nicodemus, right? These aren't found in the other gospels. And there's many other, Lazarus, right? That story is not in the gospel. So the blind man in John 9. So, John 6. What's interesting is all the gospels have the feeding of the 5,000, but only John 6 tells of the events the next day when Jesus said, "I'm the bread of life." And so it seems John chose to write about the feeding of the 5,000, not because he wanted to give his version from the other gospels, but because he was setting up what happened the next day, where he gave them physical bread, right, when he fed them. And then the next day he was telling them, look, that bread is not important. I'm the bread of life. I'm the bread you need. And so John used that story in order to set up what happened the next day to present the theological importance of receiving, accepting Christ in order to have life. And so I think John is not, he's just trying to give particular emphasis to the stories and events that really point to the person of Christ, and that would engender faith or be a warning against unbelief. John 6 was a story about unbelief because the disciples then, right, except for the 12, the big crowd rejects Jesus, walks away, and then Jesus turns to Peter and says, will you leave too? And Peter says, where will we go? You have the words of eternal life. So right there we see in John 6, the purpose is to show the contrast between belief and unbelief, and how the Father opens our eyes to believe, but those who reject him, their eyes were not opened. And then it ends with those two ominous verses about Judas being the one who would betray him. So you see in that chapter, really the focus is Jesus reveals himself as the life, and there are those who believe and those who do not. So it contrasts belief and unbelief in the person of Christ, which again links all the way to the purpose of the book in John 20. So you can do that with each story, really. There's a connection to the purpose statement of the book from each of the stories. Other thoughts, comments, or questions? So all of this really coming from the reminder that we need to understand the two historical contexts in the narratives book, and that is the historical context of the story and that of the historical context of the author. Now, the historical context of the story is, of course, the life of Christ, which takes place from, I should say this, just after Christ in the wilderness, all the way to just before his ascension. Okay? And the historical context of the author, as we just discussed, was probably, the book was probably written around 90 AD or 90 to 95 AD, somewhere in there. Now, another context we're interested in is the geographical context. So as you go through the book, you want to identify what places are mentioned. And then when you study that particular story in the book, you'll want to give more insight into that place. So for example, when we look at Samaria in John 4, we want to understand what do we know from the Bible about Samaria? What is the significance of that place and of the people there? And if you're studying in John 1 or John 11, you want to know where's Bethany, because it describes events that took place in Bethany or Nazareth or Bethlehem as you go through each of those locations. Also, as you're studying the book, you want to understand the cultural context. That is, what is the culture like in which the story took place? And so when we're talking about the Gospel of John, it took place in Israel, in the place of where the Jews lived, but they were under Roman rule and were looking for freedom. And the culture was led spiritually by the Sanhedrin, which were made up of the high priest, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, who were all self-righteous, and as we learn in his gospel, were antagonistic against Jesus. So it'll be important to understand that culture. This, by the way, is going to play a huge role in John chapter 4. We really have to understand the culture, particularly the relationship between Jew and Samaritan, to understand the story of the woman at the well. And then finally, as we've already discussed, in the background context, you want to be able to identify the occasion of the book. That is, what prompted the book to be written. Sometimes this is very difficult to find out for narratives, but for John's case, as I described earlier, understanding the attacks on the person of Christ during the latter part of the 1st century helps give us insight that prompted John to write this gospel to focus on the person of Christ, as he says in his purpose statement. Okay, so those are the things, again, from the Gospel of John, looking at the background of the book. And then finally, the third step is to understand the literary context or contextual flow of the book. That is, what is the author's flow of thought? What are each of the stories in the book? How do those stories connect together? There is a flow there. He doesn't just choose stories at random, but chooses particular stories that generally follow the chronology, but not always. And those stories then are selected in order to build his case and who the person of Christ is. And so what I did here, I don't know if you can see it very well. It'll be in your notes that I send you, but I basically just tried to summarize or identify each story in the book. That's what you want to do for the contextual flow. When you're studying a narrative, identify each story in the book. All right, so you can at least see each of the story, the unique stories within the book. So for example, the book begins with an introduction, right? That's not a story. It just basically gives us who Jesus is. He's divine and human. And then beginning in the first story, in John chapter 1, beginning of verse 19, I just identify each of the stories and then notice that there is a larger structure to the book. Again, there's a flow of thought here, and there seems to be John has structured his book. So for example, the beginning of the book, he focuses on who Jesus is and examples of the importance of believing in him. And then even an example of that with the Samaritans. And so this first section really presents Jesus and then presents key events that took place between his first and second signs. And then there's a shift in chapter 5. In chapter 5, John begins to give us several stories that focus on the nature of unbelief. He's rejected in John 5, as Jesus declares he's God's son. Then in John 6, he's rejected after feeding the 5,000 and then saying he's the bread of life. He's teaching in the temple in John 7 and John 8, and he encounters opposition there. Then in John 9, he actually heals a man born blind, but the Jewish leaders, despite that obvious miracle, refused to believe. And then he rebukes them really at the Feast of Dedication. I should put it that way. He rebukes the Jewish leaders. He calls them hirelings, if you'll remember. And he's the good shepherd in contrast to them who are hirelings. And then another example of unbelief, he actually raises a man from the dead. But John 12, the Pharisees want to kill Lazarus and Jesus. So we really see an focus on unbelief from John 5 through John 12. Then John 13, it moves towards giving attention specifically to Jesus and his disciples in the final days. All right. So you can see there's clear focus in sections of the book. The first part is the introduction. Then the first section focuses on the nature of belief. The second section on the nature of unbelief. And then the third section really gives attention to Jesus's time with his disciples. And then the last section is the crucifixion and the resurrection. And in each of these sections, there is a particular focus. And then I've identified each of the stories within those sections. So this is something you want to do when you're studying a book, is try to see the overall structure of the book and what is the flow of thought. I found a helpful table here. I don't know if you can see it very well. Let me try to expand this. from Insight for Living, Chuck Swindoll's ministry. I thought he did a good job in this table of sort of showing this larger structure of the book and indicating, again, the sections I mentioned, chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 12, 13 to 17, and then so he gives some, identifies the general idea from each section, and then who the audience is, the time period, and then some of the key statements there, and then the purpose statement of the book. So this is just a nice, helpful chart as well that you can look at in the notes later. But what's nice about this is being able to sort of see the whole book at one time and see how it's connected, how it's linked together, what the structure of the book is. You want to be able to do that so that that shows that you have an understanding of the book as a whole, and then you want to know, how does my story fit here? Where is it in this flow of the book? So for example, we're going to be looking at John 4 together, and that we find John 4 here, okay, in the section that gives attention to the nature of belief, of faith, true faith, and what it is, and even an example of it here from the woman at the well. And notice it comes between the first sign, who Jesus is, and the second sign. Remember, John said in his purpose statement, which, where is it here? John says, therefore many other signs, notice, Jesus performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these, what are these? Signs that Jesus performed have been written so that you may believe he is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. Well, what is the first sign? Well, that's why we have the story of the wedding at Cana. It's not in any of the other Gospels. All right? But John included it because it was the first sign, the first miracle that demonstrated Jesus, in this case, is divine. All right? So we see that in here, the wedding at Cana. Okay? So it's the first sign that he's the coming one. And then John identifies a second sign as the healing again in Cana. It happened there when he healed the servant there. And between those two signs, we have the story of Nicodemus and the story of the woman at the well. Very interesting. Two extended dialogues with an individual related to the gospel, related to the Messiah. We don't see that in any of the other gospels really like that. We do have cases where Jesus speaks to an individual, like, for example, the rich young ruler, or he's approached by a scribe in one case in Matthew 22. But here we have two extended gospel dialogues by our Lord with an individual. And notice these two individuals. One is Nicodemus. The other is a woman at the well. We'll talk more about that. Significant contrast here in how Nicodemus responds versus how the woman at the well responds. But in any case, we want to know, okay, where does my story fit in the structure of the book, in the flow of the book? That will be helpful to us to understand what John is doing and why he put the story there. Because again, our number one question as an expositor, as we try to understand the passage, is why did the author put this here? Why did he give us this account? How does it fit? What's he trying to teach us? So that's why we want to know before you focus on a particular passage or story within a book, you really have to understand the book overall. As we've said a few times when we're together, to understand the background of the book and understand the flow of thought, the structure of the book, and how the story that you are going to study, how that fits in that structure, in that flow. All right. Comments or questions on that? I know this is a lot of this is review, but this is to set us up to prepare us for our study of John 4. Are there any comments or thoughts, questions before we move to John 4? Okay, well, I want to give you guys a chance to give input here. So what we're going to do at this point is now focus our attention. Now, once you've studied the book as a whole, if I can find it. Once you've looked at the first 3 steps, which examines the book as a whole, now we're ready for step 4, which is to focus attention on a particular part of the book, a particular story in the book. And the first thing we want to do is the narrative analysis for that particular story. We want to focus attention now on studying that story and analyzing it as a story. That's what we were covering in the last several sessions together, but now I would like to do that for John chapter 4. So if you remember, the narrative analysis consists of four parts where we study the setting, the scenes, the character, and the plot. And again, remember, the setting is concerned with the when and the where of the story. Where did it take place? When did it take place? Who is involved within that story? This is essentially the background context of the story. And these are the steps to do that. First, we want to read the whole story and make observations. And then we want to note any of the physical aspects of the story. That is, where does it happen? What's the location? What are we told about it? And then we want to understand the temporal aspects. That means the time. When does the story happen? Not necessarily the year, but just what is the time mentioned within the story? And then the cultural aspects. That is, who is in the story? What do we know about the culture of those who are within the particular story? And then if there's anything else that seems significant or important in the setting of the story, particularly as connected perhaps to the story before and after. All right. So those are the steps. So what I'd like us to do in the time we have remaining is let's read the story of John chapter 4, and then I'll give you some time to make some observations from the story. And then if we're able, we'll discuss that. But first, let's just read the story, John chapter 4. And I've broken it up into a few verses each, so I want to give you guys a chance to read. If we could start with Tungin, if you could read verses 1 to 6. And then Pastor Philip, if you could read 7 through 11. And then Fu Wei, if you could read 12 to 16. And then I'll ask Shulong, if you could read 17 to 22. And then Kaptup, if you could see this, 23 through 26. And then Jiangchen, if you could read 27 to 32. And Joshua, 33 to 38. Okay, hopefully I divided that up okay. All right, so Tangin, can you start us off?
Okay. John chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were. He left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being worried from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour.
Verses 7 to 11. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you a living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then you get that living water?"
Verse 12 to verse 16. You are no greater than our father Jacob. Are you, who gave us the well and drank for it himself, and his son and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whosoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water, springing out to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here."
The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and your people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews."
But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipper will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman says to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus says to her, "I who speak to you am he."
At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the man, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about."
So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat, did he?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case, the saying is true, one sows, another reaps. I send you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor.
From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, "He told me all the things that I've done." So when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Many more believed because of his word, and they were saying to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world." Okay. Well, that is a longer story. As I said, I wanted to have us tackle this one together. So what we want to do, the first step is to make observations. So what I want to give you guys some time, and just you'll probably need have your Bible open in front of you, and just go through the story and make observations. That is, what sticks out to you? All right. What things do you see, things that are repeated? Do you see things that seem significant? Do you have questions as you go through the passage, things that don't make sense or you don't understand, or something you would want to study more? Is there anything that stick out to you that maybe links this story to something else you remember in John, or just anything that strikes you, anything that gets your attention as you go through the passage? So take some time. I'll give you some time here to go through that on your own, and then we'll come back together and talk a little about your things that you came up with. Okay? Any questions? So really, this is the time where we're just trying to get familiar with the story. So we're just going through it again, reading through, things that we notice, things that stick out to us. You're not interpreting the story right now. Certainly you can, if you see something that you think you understand what's going on or you want to make comment, that's fine. But this step is not, interpreting the story and making a sermon. We're just trying to get familiar with it. So what events took place, what happened, what sticks out to you, what questions come to your mind, just those kinds of things. What seems to be emphasized, what's interesting to you, those kind of things. All right, so I'll be quiet now and give you guys some time on your own to look at it. I'm going to put a story back up in a smaller font here for you. All right, any questions before we go? Guess it doesn't show that much more. Okay, why don't you go ahead? I'll be here if you have any questions. And you can just write your observations down on a piece of paper. If you have your computer, you can type them in. And then just make sure to note the verse numbers too, by the way. So if you notice something, just write the verse number and then make comment about it, okay? All right. We just have a few more minutes, but I thought we would at least just start by seeing what you came up with, what observations you had. Again, we're not doing any, we're not interpreting here. It's more of just things that we're noticing from the text. So I thought probably the easiest way to do this might be first, if there were any general observations that you had from the passage overall, and then I thought maybe we could just sort of break it down by section. So anything stick out to anybody just from the passage overall? Anything that you saw that
Jesus intended to leave the unbeliefs and head to those who will believe.
okay, where should I put this? Hold on a second. Find a place.
Yeah, and Jesus starts out all alone in the beginning, and by the time it comes to the end, he has the disciples and the whole village and everybody there. That certainly is a difference from well water to living water. And Jesus draws. See how he draws a crowd, and then he calls them out to himself. Here we have the first Gentile church. It's a called out people. Philip goes right over there at Pentecost and takes advantage of it. He's a good observer. He pays attention to what's going on. And yeah, it's a marvelous example of what Messiah does when he shows up. He shows up alone, but he isn't alone very long. He draws the people out to himself. Well water to living water.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Sorry, Jiang Chen, what was your observation? I didn't get a chance to type it out here.
Jesus intended to leave those unbeliefs, and he heading to those who will believe.
Yeah, Jesus, yeah, he left was it Jerusalem? I can't remember now. Judea, yeah. Left Judea, came to unbelievers, or how did you put it? Sorry.
Those who he knows will believe.
Yeah, to those who, yeah. Okay, good. All right, good.
Okay, here. Can I say something?
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead.
Okay, from verse 9, I think 9, right? Okay. For Jews have not no dealings with Samaritans, but here this is very interesting thing happened. It said in verse 5, so he came to the city. Sorry. Okay, in verse 8, he said, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Okay, so these Jews seems seemingly started varying to encounter with the enemy, right? So I'm very cautious why it happened.
Why what happened?
Yeah, why it happened? This is my observation because in verse 9, For Jews has no dealings with Samaritans, but the disciples seemingly has something to show that they are willing to deal with these Samaritans, go to Sychar to buy food.
So maybe, yeah, what does John mean by no dealings?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a question I would have, because maybe that word dealings has a different idea, because it seems like, yeah, verse 8, they do go to see them. So, but then verse 9 says they don't have dealings. So it's a good question. Great. Any others things that stick out to you guys just from the story overall?
Yeah, like when we come to verse 7, like there came a woman. So specifically the author point out that Samaria woman. So Jesus talk did not discriminate gender, something like that, in public square also.
Yeah, and something that I noticed reading the story was her name was never mentioned. She was always just called the woman, or the Samaritan woman of Samaria, but her name was never given for some reason. I don't know if that's significant. It just stuck out to me as I was reading through the story. How about you, Pastor Philip? Anything in general that you noticed?
Yeah. So, Pastor, like in verse 9, the author's comment, for Jews have no dealings with the Samaritan. I think in verse 6, the author's comment, is it the author's comment that he mentioned the hour? It was about the 6th hour.
Yes. Yeah, the first 6 verses, right, are all from the narrator, just giving us some of the background, right? And he actually tells us the exact time. So yeah, verse 6, the author gives the exact time that they met. So my question would be, what's the significance of that? Is that important for some reason, or why does he mention the specific time?
Because the author would love to draw the attention of his audience about the significant time of meeting Jesus. Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman. Or I'm not so sure whether is it the cultural background.
Yes, like what's the reason behind that?
Yeah.
All right, good.
This raises up another question. In the verse 7, there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Did that woman come alone?
Yes, it appears she's alone, huh?
And all the way, along the conversation, it seems like only Jesus had the conversation with this woman alone. Where is the rest?
Yeah, good question. I think in verse verse 27, right? He'd been speaking with a woman, doesn't mention anybody else there. So yeah, she was apparently came alone. In the 6th hour, which would have been around noon, around 12 o'clock noon. So, okay, well, this is a good start. Keep your notes, because when we gather together again next week, I want to spend some more time going through this, making observations. We'll read this again because we need to get familiar with the story. I'm sure all of us are pretty familiar with the story, but it's important to not just assume things, but look at it freshly and see what things seem to stick out to you. And again, we're not really making conclusions at this point. We're just trying to notice things that get our attention, things that seem important or interesting or confusing. So what I'd like to do is have you guys keep your notes. Next week we'll start here, making a few more observations, and then we'll go to the next step of looking at the setting together. Okay? But this is a great start. These are some really good observations. Okay, but it's getting late, and I want to give you guys a chance to get some rest. Thank you for your inputs. Are there any final comments or questions before we end for this evening and pick it up next time? I'm thankful to the Lord for good Wi-Fi this time. So no interruptions or end. So next week, Lord willing, I'll be meeting with you from my home. But I would appreciate your